This comment was on a video where I'm talking about how I've been no contact with my relatives on my mother's side of my family. And they're not my family. I was trying to stay away from that word. Anyway, with my relatives for over 30 years. My mother is a sociopath and a narcissist. My grandfather is a child molester. My grandmother is the person who directly with knowledge fed me to my grandfather. Just for context and understanding, because when I read this comment, I want people to know that this person put this comment on a video where I disclosed all of that. And even more than that, I mean, my mother tried to unalive me by dropping me out of a 2-story window when I was around 5 years old. And I ended up with 2 broken arms and walking away. I'm sure she wasn't happy about that at all. But just to give some background, because, well, I'm going to read the comment and then you'll understand. Those of you who understand will understand, and those of you who don't, well, you won't and you never will. So here we go. Ready? Let's get into it. What made your grandfather and mother abusive? Were they born okay but decided to be cruel without anything else influencing them? How are you different? Sometimes it's just like, it's mind-blowing to me. How would I know whether or not anybody in my group of relatives were born defective or bad or damaged? Because people who intentionally abuse other people, they have a defect, right? So that's why I'm using the word defective. Obviously, I think it's obvious, but I guess it's not obvious on this one. People who turn around and do terrible things with intention to children in particular have had something happen to them along the way that broke them into the kind of person that would even have a thought to hurt somebody else. That doesn't mean they can't control themselves. That doesn't mean they don't know right from wrong. Because if they didn't know right from wrong, they would do the same thing in public that they do behind closed doors. My mother, whatever she experienced in her childhood, I'm going to go with her because I knew my grandparents. And I can't really go with my grandparents because I only knew my great-grandmother and I only knew her as who she was to me, which was a loving, amazing person. But I don't have enough memory of her looking backwards, the way she related to my grandmother, for example. So I don't know who she was to my grandmother. I only know who she was to me. My mother, however, I know who my grandparents were, full throttle, because I had a lot of exposure to them. I lived with them and I saw how they related to my mother. I didn't understand a lot of the things at the time. Like, for example, I didn't understand my grandmother was an alcoholic until I became an adult. You know how I figured that out? I was thinking back at a memory where there was a drink hidden behind a picture frame on a bookcase. And then I remembered, oh, underneath the sink there were always drinks with the ice half melted, like in the bathroom, in the kitchen. And I remember once even asking my grandmother about the one in the bathroom. She's like, oh, I just forgot it there. And as a small child, I was like, oh, okay. Didn't even question further, well, why would you put it there in the first place? And then, of course, I become an adult and I look back at that and go, oh, my grandmother would go from room to room and drink. And then my relatives, like my aunts and my mother, would come in and go, you're slurring your words again. And my grandfather would be yelling baloney and leave her alone. And the whole thing would, unravel from there. So I guess alcoholism was definitely a part of the reason that my mother became who she is. How am I different? Well, I also know right from wrong. And I chose to do right instead of wrong, as opposed to my mother. I didn't want my children, I have 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren, to ever experience the pain that I went through, because I know what it did to me. My mother, she experienced whatever it is she experienced that hurt her throughout her childhood. And for whatever reason, her hatred of me, her anger, her frustration, whatever it was, she wanted me to experience the same and more. That's how we're different.